Welcome to the Everybody Matters podcast, a show dedicated to the idea that when organizations care enough to show their people that who they are and what they do matter, they unlock the only business idea with truly unlimited potential. I'm Brent Stewart, your host. This podcast is an outreach of Barry-Wehmiller. Don't forget to connect with us on the web at barrywehmiller.com, on Twitter at Barry-Wehmiller, on Facebook and LinkedIn, and check out our blog, trulyhumanleadership.com. Did you know that the American Institute of Stress says that job stress is far and away the major source of stress for American adults, and that it has escalated progressively over the past few decades? They go on to say that increased levels of job stress, as assessed by the perception of having little control but lots of demands, have demonstrated to be associated with increased rates of heart attack, hypertension, and other disorders. Barry-Wehmiller CEO Bob Chapman was once interviewed in the McKinsey Quarterly about wellness in the workplace. One of the points that he made is that there's a disconnect. He basically said you can't address wellness with exercise programs and then treat people like crap. Until organizations do a better job of letting their people know they are valued and cared for, we won't even begin to move the needle on team member well-being. To paraphrase our friend and past podcast guest, Dr. Jeffrey Pfeffer, it seems the workplace is killing people and no one cares. So why and how is this happening? Bob Chapman and Dr. Pfeffer recently participated in a webinar hosted by Vitality, a wellness program provider with which Barry-Wehmiller partners, and it was called The Next Leading Cause of Death, the Workplace? During this webinar, Bob and Jeffrey both share a number of insights about these issues around wellness in the workplace. And we want to share an edited version of this conversation with you on this episode. And we're going to start things off with Dr. Jeffrey Pfeffer.
Okay, thank you. It is a pleasure to be with you. It's also a pleasure to be with somebody that you're going to introduce later, my friend Bob Chapman. He and I have been in touch about these issues for a long time, and it's my job to be his setup man. And if I do a good job, maybe there's a hope for me to be hired at Barry-Wehmiller. Which I'm quite serious about because it's probably a better employer than Stanford. The short version is that according to the Centers for Disease Control, chronic disease accounts for about somewhere between 90% or maybe as low as 75% of the healthcare costs confronted in the United States. Chronic disease is not something that is just a first world problem. It is a problem that is besetting China and India, for instance, as well. It is not just a problem of the old. The biggest loss of productive work years and life from chronic disease comes from from people in their middle ages. And there's a statistic that suggests that chronic disease that only about less than 1/4 of the U.S. workforce has no chronic disease, which means more than 75% have either one or more. Chronic disease comes from stress and the behaviors that stress induce, such as smoking, drinking, taking drugs, not exercising, overeating, etc. And the source of most stress is the workplace, and that's pretty clear from the Health Site WebMD, from the annual surveys that the American Psychological Association does, from the American Institute of Stress, which, by the way, has a ton of interesting data. If people are interested in that, you should really take a look at the American Institute of Stress. It's got a lot of data on this and suggests that the stress is a big problem and that the biggest source of stress is the workplace. To me, however, the worst problem is not that the workplace is killing people, and it is the fifth leading cause of death. It's published in an article in Management Science, but in fact, not many people, believe it or not, care about this. And I can give you 3 examples. I could give you 103 examples, but I want to be relatively brief. So in 2008, Watson Wyatt, now Towers Watson, found that 48% of organizations said that job-related stress affected business performance. So about half say, yes, job-related stress affects our business performance. Only 5% said that they were doing anything to address health. Dame Carol Black, who I know is on an advisory board for Vitality for their British Workplace Survey, which they're going to talk about later, is a wonderful human being. Carrie Cooper, who's also a fabulous and long-standing expert on health in the workplace, decided to figure out if any business schools in the United Kingdom covered any material in any of their classes, in any of their courses on basically the workplace and health, and the answer was no. And finally, when I went to New Zealand, my friend Chris Till, in anticipation of my coming down there, met with the New Zealand government, which runs a health system that they are paying for, and they said, "What do you want to do about the fact that stress is rising healthcare costs?" And the New Zealand government said, stress is an inevitable part of work. There's nothing that can be done about it. There was a recent column in the New York Times that is probably the worst thing that the New York Times has ever run on the editorial page, which says, don't believe this stuff about burnout and stress. It's not as bad as it looks, which is, of course, completely incorrect. The thing that I think managers and leaders on this call ought to pay attention to is that organizational decisions and practices profoundly affect human health. Do you offer health insurance, which is a big issue? Do you have jobs that provide people discretion so that they can actually use their gifts and skills and are treated like adults? Do you have work hours that permit people to get sufficient amounts of rest? And do you provide social support and conditions so that people have friends at work and they are supported in their workplace stressors? Do you have practices that reduce or exacerbate, the other way it could go, work-family conflict? Do you treat people in a just and fair way? Otherwise, when people are treated unjustly, they will mostly experience that as stress and will respond with increased stress and the biological things that stress accounts for. And finally, one of the biggest problems, I think, in today's world is layoffs and economic insecurity. Many companies, 3G Capital being a main one, but many companies, are laying people off right and left and are scheduling people in ways that they cannot understand or predict what their schedules are going to be or what their wages are going to be from week to week if they're hourly paid. So layoffs and economic insecurity are another enormous source of stress. We have learned over the years, and there's a large literature on this, that stress has particular effects on various hormones, on biological processes. So this is not just an issue of, well, we got some stress and then we observe some outcomes. The biological mechanisms through which stress affects human health is actually quite well known. When you look at what the largest effects on increasing self-reported health, self-reported ill health, work-family conflict doubles the odds of having self-reported ill health. Job insecurity increases the self-reported ill health by 50%. High job demands, 50%. Low job control, 40%. Low social support, 40%. So these are reasonably large figures. These are reasonably large numbers. When we did the analyses, the meta-analyses, which is a summary of all the epidemiological evidence available to come up with these estimates, my colleague who I did this with, Stefano Zinio, said, nobody knows what an odds ratio is. We need to compare this to something. And he decided, and I think it was a good decision, to compare it to secondhand smoke, a known and regulated carcinogen. So if you take these numbers and some other numbers in the paper that we wrote and say, how bad is this? The answer is it is basically as bad as secondhand smoke. So the health effects of many of these workplace stressors are about as bad as secondhand smoke, a known and regulated carcinogen. The worst thing, in addition to the fact that nobody seems to care about this, except for Bob Chapman and a few of his colleagues who he's been able to influence to actually steward, a word that he uses that I think is exactly the right word, and understand the responsibility that they have for the humans who work for them, is that we are killing people for no good reason. It's not like you're saying, well, I got to choose between making money and, killing people, though I'm not sure that killing people is ever, justified even for making money. But the great irony in all of this is that many of the work practices that are the most harmful for the human beings who work in these organizations don't help the organizations either. either. So, for instance, layoffs, economic insecurity. We do know that layoffs decrease morale and increase fear. We do know that layoffs disrupt the networks of relationships that are helpful for innovation when different units inside the organization have to coordinate with each other. We certainly know from probably 20 years of epidemiological evidence that layoffs more than double the suicide rate and increase overall mortality by 40% in the years just following layoffs, and increase cardiovascular disease. However, layoffs do not increase profits, increase productivity, or, believe it or not, increase stock price. There's a lot of evidence for that as well. We know that work hours are not particularly good for people. The health effects of work hours has been studied for a long time. The effects of work hours on blood pressure, the effects of work hours on sleep, which is very important as a source of a high-functioning immune system, etc. But we also know, if you look at the OECD data, that the more on average hours a country works, the lower its productivity. We know from studies of industries inside the U.S. that when work hours go up in those industries, productivity goes down. We know this even at the individual level of country analysis. The idea that working more hours somehow produces higher output in and of and by itself is just incorrect. So the irony is, and we also know for things like job control, that if you gave people more autonomy on the job, we've known for 40 years, maybe more, that the job discretion, the job autonomy is positively related to people's creativity, is positively related to their employee engagement. And so if you don't micromanage people, you not only don't make them sick, but they in fact are more motivated, creative, and engaged. So we do in a lot of things things that do not help the organization and make people sicker in the process. So I think that there are really two things that we need to do. First, we need to measure health and well-being. A single item of self-reported health prospectively predicts medical outcomes. I'm currently doing a study with Leanne Williams in which we're looking at prescription use drug data, and it turns out prescriptions for antidepressants prospectively predict people's being on prescription drugs for cardiovascular disease and a bunch of other things subsequently, controlling for a bunch of other stuff, so that you can measure health and well-being. You can measure prescription drug use. So you are not running a healthy company if everybody is on antidepressants. Or as somebody said to me when she went to work for a large high-tech company, I went on antidepressants within 1 week, and I soon found out that all my colleagues were taking antidepressants also. So we ought to measure health and well-being very much as we've come to measure other elements of a company's environmental impact. We ought to measure the effect of the company and its management practices on the human environment. But most importantly, and this is a fabulous lead-in to Bob, because Lord knows Bob Chapman does this, to prioritize human health, well-being, and sustainability. The most important thing you can do, for instance, if I said to you, I want you to make your customer experience better, you would prioritize the customer experience, and you would figure out ways to make it better. So a lot of what we are able to do in organizations, you say, we want to prioritize product quality. Okay, we're going to get measures of product quality. We're going to try some experiments to see how to make quality better. We're going to run a high-quality manufacturing operation, and we will improve quality. At the moment, the biggest problem is that there are too few human beings who are like my colleague and friend Bob Chapman, who prioritize human well-being and sustainability. In many companies, in the CEOs I talk to and the HR people I talk to, they say, well, suppose my CEO says I have to make the quarterly numbers. Suppose my CEO says, we have to do this, that, or the other thing. We've got to get a product release out. We've got to do this. We've got to do that. Well, first of all, most of the things that you're going to do are not going to help health or the productivity. But holding that aside, we have, I think, in many organizations and maybe even as a society, come to underemphasize the importance of human well-being, the importance of human life, the importance of human sustainability. We've prioritized excessively short-term financial gains and financial profits. So the first and most important thing companies ought to do is understand that healthy people are more productive. Less stressed people, less likely to turn over. Healthy people, less likely to incur healthcare costs. This is all absolutely true, and it begins with the prioritization of human well-being.
Well, I appreciate Jeff's foundation he built for this dialogue. I've always been inspired by Jeff's perspective, and I'm going to try and I'm going to share with this group what we're actually doing, none of which I'm talking about is a theory. And I'm going to start off with reminding everybody that our overriding principle in our company is we measure success by the way we touch the lives of people. And we touch the lives of people in many ways. And our goal is to send people home safe, healthy, and fulfilled by focusing on people, purpose, and performance. And an expression we use now, and in my talks around the country on leadership, is the way we lead impacts the way people live, which is a profound statement because I never was taught that in school. I never heard it when I got out of school. It was through a series of revelations I realized that I thought business was business and your personal life was personal life, but we found that not only, as Jeff said, does it affect your health the way you're treated, but it also affects the way you go home after 40 hours a week of being treated. It affects the way you treat your family, your spouse, your community. And so very much we're talking about the health of our society, not just the health of the individuals. So I'm going to give you some statistics that we have found. But first of all, a gentleman came out to the Aspen Institute a couple of years ago, a New York Times reporter, and he spoke before some of the donors to the Aspen Institute, and he said, while we do good in the world, could we do less harm? And they said, what do you mean? I said, it's great that we write checks to major institutions, charitable organizations in this country, but the greatest act of charity is how you treat the people you have the privilege of leading. That is the foundation upon which charity should be built in this country. And unfortunately, we don't ask people how they got their money, which is the harm we're doing. So we might write a check to the United Way, but then we don't treat the people, if I have 5,000, 10,000, 400 people in our care, and we're actually hurting the very society that we're trying to support. So some statistics we've gained from our perspective, and there's a variety of these, 3 out of 4 people in this country are disengaged in what they're doing. 74% of people say work is the leading cause of stress, and Jeff even gave some higher numbers. Raj Sisodia, my co-author, told me there's a 20% increase in Monday mornings at 4 a.m. when people have to go back to work. And most importantly, and I was never taught this, I never read it, I never heard it, until recently in this journey we've been on to raise the level of awareness of what leadership should be. The person you report to at work is more important to your health than your primary care doctor, which validates this message that Jeff just gave. The way we treat people is a major determinant for their health. I suspect nobody who is promoted to a position of leadership is ever told, not only will the way you treat the people now in the accounting department, the sales department, production department, will it affect the performance, but it's going to affect the way they treat their spouse and their kids and the way they behave in our communities. And it's going to affect their health. It's going to be the major. And how do we prepare people to have those positions of responsibility of health and care? We don't. We say, well, he was a good accountant, he was a good manager, he's got a good degree, and we put him in positions of impacting people's health without any skill or understanding of that impact. This is a statistic we came across recently. 65% of employees would rather see their boss fired than get a pay increase. And 58% of people say they'd trust a stranger more than they would their boss. So, what we really have in our society is leadership malpractice. And I now say we have an epidemic of anguish. I was recently spoke to a group of university presidents. And the biggest issue we have in our campuses right now, is that the kids entering our universities have a epidemic level of anxiety and depression, and the schools don't know how to deal with this responsibly. They're not prepared to deal with this. And so where's that coming from? Where did the homes in society were coming from? They're coming from homes where their parents worked in environments where they didn't feel appreciated. They came home exhausted, stressed, and what are the kids experiencing? They're experiencing this at every facet of where they live. So we're really kind of self-destructing. Jeff says, we're dying for a paycheck. I said we're self-destructing in the interest of economic gain. So in my journey, I've learned that the word management, which is used in our education system, in our titles, management is the manipulation of others for my success. Leadership is the stewardship of the lives entrusted you, which is a profound responsibility. And in our education system, we need to prepare people to be leaders. As I have had the chance to talk in the healthcare community, and I, first invited, I sat around, I kind of listened to people, what they're talking about. My impression that most of these conferences on healthcare are because the cost is going up so much, and we need to do something to reduce cost. What can we do? Can we negotiate with the pharmaceutical companies? Can we negotiate with the hospitals? Can we negotiate with the insurance companies? We're constantly focused on cost. What we should be focused on is caring for the people. That is what we need. We need to move from focusing on cost to focusing on care, which would reduce the stress, which we know for a fact would reduce the demand for health care and allow people to go home feeling valued. Everybody in the world wants to know that who they are and what they do matters. And when we show them in thoughtful ways and on a timely basis, it profoundly affects their attitude and the way they treat others. And the other thing I noticed is in a healthcare program, we provide a lot of information, a lot of data. It's just like business, financial results. We need to move from providing information to providing inspiration. How do we inspire people to embrace their responsibility for not only their own health and model that health, but to share it with others? So that's a key focus, and that came from sitting in on these conferences. So our vision of well-being, before we were, again, as I said, we were focused on negotiating with insurance. Every year we'd focus on how much is the employee going to participate. It was all about negotiating costs, because that's what business is. It's about controlling costs, optimizing profit. Now we're focusing on caring and inspiring healthy lifestyle and healthy choices. And the result, the byproduct will be, I'll give you, just for listeners, we had an issue with Workmans compensation claims some years ago, and our teams came together and they said, what are we going to do if we don't reduce our Workmans compensation claims? We're going to blow our budget. And our team came together and says, well, if we measure success by the way we touch the lives of people, what does this mean? And they came up with an expression that we don't want our friends to get hurt. They didn't come up with an expression, they want to reduce claims. They didn't come up with a statement, they want more days without lost time accidents. All data. They said simply, we don't want our friends to get hurt. And guess what happened to our workman's compensation claims? So my point is we need to move from information, days without lost time accident, et cetera, to inspiration. How do we inspire people to be good stewards of their health and therefore inspire those around them? So moving from information to inspiration. The way we lead clearly impacts the way people live, and we don't teach that in our universities. We don't practice that in our businesses. We don't focus on that because it's all about numbers. Business has always been about numbers, and we need a human revolution to align with the industrial revolution. So while we create economic value, we're creating human value, which is critical in our society because we're kind of self-destructing. So we found among the 25 engaged in their jobs, that 25% that are engaged in their job and thriving in their lives, they have 41% lower health-related costs than struggling employees, 62% lower health-related costs than suffering employees. So statistics show that when people love what they do and enjoy what they do, they have dramatically less health care because obviously in that environment they're less stress. So how do we create, I always say, why do we call them jobs? We want to get a job. You can't say the word job with a smile. Why don't we get them a joy, a chance to express their gifts and be appreciated for us? So thank you.
Thanks, Bob. I'm really interested in your journey and how you got to some of these thoughts. Was this just a perspective you've always had in terms of how to lead, or was there a point where you came to these conclusions, and if so, what was it that made you really start to lead in such a different way?
Well, there were really three, three. The first was, I said to myself one day, why do we call it work? Why can't it be fun? And so my first revelation was, why can't business be fun? Okay, why do we leave work to have fun and joy? So we started doing some things to bring fun into the workplace that aligned with creating value. We saw profound changes in joy and behavior, and we were surprised. The second was, I said to myself one day, business is the most powerful force for good in the world because we have people in our care for 40 hours a week. We're the most powerful force in the world for good in the world. So I walked out and said, I've got to the way I run this business is the most powerful force for good in the world. It's not about my profit or the company's profit or our shareholders. It's about our ability to create human value and economic value and harmony. A lot of people ask me, how do you justify doing this? How do you justify caring, Bob? How do you, what kind of return on investment are you getting in these caring initiatives? I said, how do you justify not caring? When you look at our society, when you look at the lowest unemployment in 50 years and the highest level of anxiety we've had in decades, how can that be? People have jobs. We're at peace in the world. Why do they have anxiety? Because the way people are treated. And this is just not business. I find this in education. Healthcare is one of the worst places. We were invited into the healthcare industry to look at the tremendous problem they're having with burnout, accidental deaths in hospitals, et cetera. And again, they too need to focus on the people. And we called in the healthcare industry, we came up with the expression, loved ones caring for loved ones. The people providing the healthcare service, the doctors, the nurses, the staff, they're just as important as the patients. So and the final, the most significant one, was that I was at a wedding, and at the wedding, and I was watching these precious kids get married, I realized that all 12,000 people who work for me are just like that young man and lady. There's somebody's precious child that's been put in my care. And the way I treat those precious people in my care, somebody's precious child who's been put in my care, will profoundly affect the way they go home and treat their family. It will profoundly affect their realization of meaningful lives. And so it awakened me to no longer look at people as functions, an engineer, an accountant, receptionist. It made me realize people are somebody's precious child, that I will have a profound influence on their behavior. And that sense of responsibility for those 12,000 lives was profound.
And it's a difference, if I could jump in, the difference between Bob Chapman and many other CEOs comes in exactly the last sentence. It is a sense, what you get as you listen to him is a sense of stewardship and responsibility, a sense of profound, these are people who are in my care, it's a word he used, exactly right, and I have a responsibility for them. And you see organizations who are shedding responsibility. I don't want to be responsible for your pension. I don't want to be responsible for your health care. I'm not responsible even for your career. We have you sign an at-will employment thing, or you're not having a job for life. So on the one hand, companies have over the last decade shed responsibility, and Bob has said, I'm going to take responsibility for the human beings whose lives have been entrusted to me.
Thanks, Bob. Jeff, a question for you. You mentioned a study we've been doing in the UK, Britain's Healthiest Workplace. For those in the audience, this is something we've been doing since 2013. It's in combination with University of Cambridge, Rand Corporation, Financial Times. It includes both an employer survey and an employee survey, all anonymized, and it really been collecting over 150 variables, looking, I think, interestingly at the links between people's health, their performance at work, and then the work environment. And we now, since we've got over 5 years of data, we've got about 20 million data points. We think it's one of the sort of richest data sources of its kind, where you've got both the employee perspective and some of the work environment factors. And what we're seeing there, as you know, is that the data really reinforces the intuition in that companies that are healthier and have healthy environments are really seeing healthier behaviors and better performance from their people, and that companies that over the period actually managed to improve their practices saw those improvements play out in terms of how well people were performing at work and how successful the businesses were. So Jeff, the question for you, and this I think was also one of the questions we've got from the audience, is given the data and given the intuition, why don't more employers do this? Why don't more employers prioritize well-being and human health? Is it really just this focus on profit and the bottom line?
Well, it can't be focused of profit on the bottom line because as your preamble to the question makes it clear, in fact, the way you increase profit in the bottom line and the whole message of Bob Chapman's fabulous story is that the way you increase profits is you build a healthier workforce. You would never say, I'm going to run a bunch of horses around the racetrack, but you're going to run sick horses around the racetrack and hope they win the race. I mean, that doesn't work. In every domain, better care for your machinery, better care for your human beings, better care for people results in less turnover and less illness and higher performance and lower absenteeism, lost work days, higher and lower presenteeism as well. So it's not an issue of we're trading this off for the bottom line. Bob, I think, made a very important point, which people aren't trained on this. Carol Black and Kerry Cooper did this data in which basically this is material which is being covered at the moment that they did the survey in no business schools and in no business school courses. I think that's a source of the problem. But I also think a source of the problem is, there's a saying that seeing is believing. I also believe that believing is seeing. That you will never accept, and I see this with CEOs. I've presented to CEOs and HR people, and, you present them a ton of data on the effect of work hours on productivity, which is basically zero or negative, and the effect of work hours on health, which is adverse. And then, 5 minutes into the conversation, somebody says, well, I need to work people harder in order to get, this project done. And I say to them, what did you, like, no evidence that this is going to work. So we really have, I think, this is why Bob Sutton and I, about 13 years ago, wrote a book on evidence-based management. We have a tremendous number of decisions being made in business on a daily basis and the complete absence of any kind of objective evidence. So, and this would be one more manifestation. We think, I don't need to care about my people. It won't cause my profits to suffer. No, that's not true. I can do this, I can do that. It's not going to affect my healthcare costs. No, that's not true. So I think we have a huge disconnect between the data, the evidence, and and the reality. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote Dying for a Paycheck. And that's one of the reasons why Bob Chapman spends so much of his own precious time going around talking to groups of business people with statistics, with data, with his own examples, trying to make the case that it is not, healthy people or profits. It is the two go completely together.
Okay. Well, I'm curious your take on the same question. Really, why are you unusual? Why aren't more of your peers thinking the same way? And what do you say to the skeptics? To those who think it's a nice idea but not something they're going to put into practice in their organizations.
If we were standing outside and the moon was out, and I looked up and I said, see the moon up there? Does anybody debate? Nope, we don't debate it. But nobody has any idea how to get there. When I share our truly human leadership, nobody in any facet of our society debates it. In fact, most people completely agree with what I say, but it is not taught, it is not practiced, and people don't know how. If I said on Monday we're going to teach Chinese as the main language of the company, everybody say, okay, but I don't know how to do it. So the problem is we have decades. The Industrial Revolution began around economic gain. It was never about human gain. We thought if we paid people better, they'd be fine because they could buy a home, they could send their kids to education, they could take vacations. So we began with an Industrial Revolution. It was all about economic value creation. It was never about human. But we assumed that if we gave people jobs and they made money, they would do well. So we again, our business schools, again, I was taught management classes, got a management degree, and got a job in management. So what did I think I was supposed to do? I was supposed to manage people. I was never taught to inspire. I was never taught to care for people. It was always about me. And, as a good friend of mine, Bill Urey, said, we need to move from a me society to a we society. We need executives of these corporations to understand that they have people in their span of care, and the way they lead that company profoundly affects the lives of the people they have the privilege of leading. Until we do that, we're going to be trying to negotiate with insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies and get costs down, and we're working on the wrong end of the curve. We should reduce demand so we don't need to negotiate with these. But the problem is the way we're running this company, we're increasing demand for healthcare, which increases the pricing, which increases the cost, and increases the stress.
Yeah, thank you both. We have a question here that's asking, are workplace stressors variable based on industry, public or private sector, or do you see a lot of the same stressors across demographics and industries?
Jeff?
Yeah, I would say the biggest, and you can tell this from the webinar that we've just had today. One does not need to know what industry Barry-Wehmiller is in. The effect of Barry, the reason why Barry-Wehmiller is the company that it is because of Bob Chapman. So you can see companies in retail like Patagonia that are great. You can see companies in retail that are horrible. You can see high-tech companies that are fabulous, and you can see high-tech companies that are sweatshops where people are on antidepressants, where they're counting the minutes until their stock vests and they can walk out the door. And so I see no particular industry or effect. Now there are some industries which are notorious. I think the legal industry, investment banking. Bob mentioned burnout in physicians. There are some industries that I think have gotten some highlighting and whatever. But in general, this comes down, and it's a word that Bob Chapman has used a zillion times during the talk today, and it is exactly the right word. It comes down to leadership. If you have a company in manufacturing like Barry-Wehmiller that's led by a leader by Bob Chapman, by a leader like Bob Chapman, it's going to do fine. If you have a company that's ostensibly in a high-margin industry, that has almost no competition, and it's led by somebody who does not care about the precious children whose care they've been entrusted with, it's going to be bad. So this really it comes down to what the leader does and whether or not that leader. I cannot emphasize this enough because it's a point on which Bob and I agree completely. Whether the leader of that company accepts the responsibility, the stewardship for the human beings whose lives have been entrusted to that individual.
Jeff, that reminds me, I was interviewed by some organizational development professors from a major university a few years ago, and at the end of an hour and a half interview, they said, you're the first CEO I've ever talked to that didn't talk about his product. And I said, we've been talking about our product for the last hour and a half. It's our people.
Of course.
We all need an economic engine to give people a chance to express their gifts and create an economic lifestyle. But our goal is not our product. Our goal is the people, to find a way in which to create an opportunity for people to express their gifts and go home each night being appreciated, because that is the key to the society we want for our children, our friends, our family, and our community. It's a society where everybody matters, that we genuinely care about the people. And the product is important, but the product is not the focus of the product. Because if we create the right environment for our people, the product will be great and the customers will be served, and we'll have a society where people treat their families as they have been treated all week. So clearly, this is a crisis. It is something we need to stand back and say, what is our role in creating this anguish in our society? Why are kids and families and feeling this way? Because we are not being good stewards of the people. And this is, as Jeff said, in every facet of our society. It is not just business. It's in education. It's in healthcare. It's in the military. It's in the government. I speak in every facet, and we are kind of self-destructing in the interest of economic gain.
And the irony is you don't get economic gain from it.
Nope. Yeah.
If you'd like to find out more about Dr. Jeffrey Pfeffer and his book, Dying for a Paycheck, go to jeffreypfeffer.com. That's JEFFREYPFEFFER.com, or you can find him on Twitter at Jeffrey Pfeffer. If you'd like to find out more about Bob Chapman and Rosh Zodia's book, Everybody Matters, The Extraordinary Power of Caring for Your People Like Family, go to everybodymattersbook.com. For updates on this book, the podcast, lots of great content and insight, don't forget to connect with us on the web at barrywehmiller.com, on Twitter at barrywehmiller, on Facebook and LinkedIn, and check out our blog, trulyhumanleadership.com. I'm Brent Stewart, thanks for listening, and don't forget, Everybody Matters is the only business idea with truly unlimited potential.